Today we're focusing on the topic of delivering the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and we're delighted to be joined by all of you, which is probably the largest audience we've had for this year's series of lectures. I'd also like to thank our keynote speakers for their generous time to inform us on this topic. We are delighted to have the Secretary-General of the Commonwealth, Baroness Patricia Scotland, QC. Also joining us, but running slightly late, is Gwen Hines, who's the Director of the International Relations Division of the UK Department for International Development. And from the University of Southampton, Professor Sybren Drijfhout, which I think I have not murdered, who's a professor in physical geography and climate physics. I'm also personally delighted to welcome so many of our valued Hartley Circle members to this event. These are donors who have supported the university through philanthropy over, in many cases, a number of years. So welcome. My name is Mark Spearing. I'm your institutional host this evening. I'm the Vice President for Research and Enterprise. I am filling in at slightly short notice in this part of my role on behalf of my colleague, Professor Colin Grant, the Vice President International, who returned from India last night and brought with him some sort of bug, which may be something to do with some of the Sustainable Development Goals. Tonight's lecture is also being live streamed, and I'd like to welcome everyone viewing over the web to this discussion, particularly our alumni community. You'll be able to join in the panel discussion later by tweeting your questions using the hashtag UOS lectures, and that should be available online. This feed will be monitored during the panel discussion, and we hope to include as many questions as possible. If you'd like to join in or comment on what you're hearing tonight, do please use the hashtag. Those present will also be able to ask questions, and during the panel discussion we will have roving mics on the floor, but please wait for the microphone before asking your question, otherwise those on the live feed won't be able to hear you. And last, on the general introduction, some housekeeping. If the fire alarms sound during these presentations, it will not be a drill, and you will be directed by staff from the building to the correct exit and muster point. So broadly, the fire exits are at the back of the room and at that side. And one final note, our university photographer, John, is also present and will be taking photographs during the keynotes and the panel discussion. So now on to the programme tonight. We'll shortly hear from our three expert speakers who will each deliver a keynote lecture, and this will then be followed by a panel discussion. At the United Nations General Assembly in September 2015, the countries of the world agreed a hugely ambitious set of targets to transform the planet and the lives of the people living on it. These 17 Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, are a massive challenge to the international community and will require concerted action and goodwill amongst policymakers at the national and international level over the next decade and well beyond. The SDGs cover a range of issues around people, such as ending hunger and poverty and ensuring health, education and gender equality, development, water, energy, industry and the environment, including, of course, the need to tackle climate change. Each of the individual SDGs is a huge challenge in itself, but they are also interdependent, sometimes in very complex ways. In this session tonight, we will explore some of the major challenges at the political level to deliver the Sustainable Development Goals and the issues which the international community will need to address in order to succeed. At the same time, we will look at the role that universities and academic experts can play in supporting national and international policymakers over the coming years as they grapple with these huge challenges. Please join me in welcoming our first keynote speaker, the Secretary-General of the Commonwealth, the Right Honourable Baroness Patricia Scotland, QC, who will deliver her talk on the topic of the Commonwealth convening for a sustainable future. Baroness Scotland became the 6th Secretary-General of the Commonwealth in April 2016. As Secretary-General, she is responsible for promoting and protecting the Commonwealth's values, representing the Commonwealth publicly, and the management of the Commonwealth Secretariat. Before becoming Secretary-General, she had a successful career as a barrister, being called to the bar in 1977 and appointed a Queen's Counsel in 1991. Appointed to the House of Lords in 1997, she held a number of ministerial roles in the UK government between 1999 and 2010, including as Attorney General for England and Wales and Advocate General for Northern Ireland from 2007 to 2010. Please join me in welcoming Baroness Scotland, Secretary General of the Commonwealth.
Thank you very much indeed. So, Mark, ladies and gentlemen, Commonwealth friends and colleagues, I am particularly pleased to have been invited to participate in this, the last series of lectures, and particularly to have this lecture series take place here in the architecture of the architects of the United Kingdom, because what we are talking about is how we create a new architecture to deliver the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. And next April, the presidents and prime ministers of more than 50 countries will gather here in London for the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, sometimes called CHOGM, sometimes called the Summit, as it has become known. And it will be a very significant occasion, and it is more than 40 years since this biennial meeting of Commonwealth leaders previously assembled in London. And we are a family of 52 independent and equal sovereign nations set in every continent and every ocean. We may soon be 53, and more countries are hoping to join us. There are large countries and small countries, some with advanced and some with developing economies. Populations range from the very large to the very small. We have India, which has 1.3 billion people. Tuvalu and Nauru have populations of around 11 and 13,000. So 30 of our small members are small states. Many of them are island nations. And 2.4 billion people live in the Commonwealth, a third of the population of the world, and 60% of them are below the age of 30. And as we come together as the Commonwealth, not because of shared geography or economic parity or other similarity or mutual interest. Unusually, we are united by our joint commitment to core principles: consensus and common action, mutual respect, inclusiveness, transparency, accountability, legitimacy, and responsiveness. And these are fundamental to the way in which the Commonwealth convenes for a sustainable future. It is this principles-based approach and commitment to shared values which makes the Commonwealth such a strong partnership for working together towards the Sustainable Development Goals. Our shared values and principles are drawn together in the Commonwealth Charter, adopted by heads of government of all our member states in 2012 and signed on Commonwealth Day 2013 by Her Majesty the Queen as head of the Commonwealth. And there is a pleasing congruence, and we would like to think not entirely chance correlation, between the articles of the Commonwealth Charter, which were adopted in 2012, and the goals of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development agreed in 2015. The 16 articles of the Charter, with the addition of the overarching Commonwealth principle of partnership, which we therefore include in our preamble, match almost precisely the 17 Sustainable Development Goals of the 2030 Agenda. And that Charter took 2 years, 3 months, and 11 days to agree. And it was represented by that 1/3 of the world. So getting everybody to coalesce around an agreed agenda was very important. But one of the great things I'm discovering is if the Commonwealth can fashion an agreement, it usually is capable of creating a pathway for the rest to follow. And the governments and people of our member countries are connected and work through a network of more than 80 intergovernmental, civil society, cultural and professional organisations. And our role of working to mandates delivered jointly by the government of the 52 member countries we serve is to assist them collectively and individually towards achieving inclusive, sustainable development, democracy and peace. And as Secretary General of the Commonwealth, I'm really proud to serve this very original model of international cooperation and mutual support, because we convene visionary thinking with practical expertise in that distinctively inclusive Commonwealth way of finding common ground and consensus on matters of great global concern. So working together, all can learn, each from others, about ways of innovating to strengthen governance, to build inclusive institutions, and to promote justice and human rights. And we help to bring the voices of smaller and more vulnerable states to the world, to raise awareness of a global level of their special needs and concerns. And we work in similar ways alongside young people and women so that they are empowered and include socially, politically and economically. So Commonwealth programmes and projects help to boost economic growth and encourage trade, and to address the threats such as climate change, debt and inequality. And our multiple levels of connection and engagement are distinctive features of the strength of Commonwealth cooperation and our convening power. And these are intergovernmental and regional. Some are formal, but others more informal. And there are also links and networks for exchange and support at institutional, professional and individual levels. And they are derived from and add to a broad and inclusive nature of the Commonwealth kinship and affinity, rooted in long-established relationships and continually nurturing new expressions of cooperation and partnership. And indeed, we work together not as foreigners, but as a family, with respect and understanding. And we are aided in this by our common language, the common law, similar parliamentary and other institutions, as well as our cultural ties. So it's not just humour and not just cricket. So in many areas of activity, these factors combine to create what we call the Commonwealth Advantage. And this advantage draws on the ease and simplicity with which we are able to work together, and is an immense importance to how the Commonwealth collectively responds to the needs of member states and to the needs of our citizens, their ambitions and their aspirations. It's very unusual indeed in an international fora never to have to use interpreters, even for the jokes. So fundamental to our approach and our attitude is a resolute commitment to working together through consensus and towards accord. And this enables respect and understanding to take root and to flourish, so that disagreement and division are overshadowed and can be overcome. And to help our member countries derive even greater benefits from the distinctive ease with which we work together in the Commonwealth, we are establishing an innovation hub at the Commonwealth Secretariat. And it's aimed at fostering and practicing innovation to tackle our collective issues in a smarter manner. As a repository of knowledge and expertise on successful innovation, it will collate and disseminate examples of what has worked so that we can be applied elsewhere in the Commonwealth. But we're also looking at what has not worked, which is equally important. So a network and database of experts and institutions engaged in innovation will strengthen the Commonwealth Advantage and strengthen, we believe, our ability to address the 2030 agenda. And this sits alongside the newly created Commonwealth Office of Civil and Criminal Justice Reform, which builds on our shared inheritances of the common law, similar legislative and judiciaries, and the comparable or even interoperable system of regulation. So the office draws together templates for legislation and best practice from across a broad range of disciplines and fields of activity, and it also encompasses anti-corruption, procurement, and many other areas relating to public and corporate conduct. And this is consonant with SDG 16, which recognises that the rule of law is both a means to a realisation of the numerous other development goals and also a development end in and of itself. So clear, fair, and effective legal frameworks are integral to the rule of law and development and represent the very fabric of the rules by which the state and the citizen, the private citizen, interact, as well as by which private individuals and enterprises deal with each other, both within and also between countries. So the legal frameworks touch on every aspect of daily life and every area in which the Commonwealth works, whether it's in relation to trade, economic policy, debt management, oceans and natural resources, climate change, health and education or youth, and of course the operation of the justice system itself. So within each of these areas, a huge amount of legal research, detailed policy and development, public consultation, and cutting-edge legislative innovation is undertaken across our Commonwealth each and every day. And whether with the passing of an innovative Climate Change Fund Act, such as occurred recently in Tuvalu, or the reform of company law to lower the threshold for business establishment, such as took place in India, or the promulgation of a future-looking cybercrime act, such as in the Seychelles, legislative innovation in the Commonwealth is thriving. And each small improvement in our laws, which is effectively implemented, contributes to better governance and enhanced opportunities for peoples of the Commonwealth. And conversely, where legal frameworks and the rule of law are allowed to stagnate, we see evidence of the adverse impacts on development. And at COP23, we launched our Law and Climate Change Toolkit, providing access across all 52 Commonwealth states to the best and most salient legal statutes and frameworks required to support climate change. And many influences come to bear. But we know that the rule of law and human development are intimately intertwined. So the strengthening of legal frameworks is a vital factor in realising our shared developmental aims, and other factors intervene from time to set back development and progress. And many of our smaller and our more vulnerable members' countries have recently been disrupted and in some cases absolutely devastated by these extreme weather events and other catastrophes. I'm sure all of you will have seen the devastation of Barbuda and the devastation also of the country of my birth, Dominica, which has been damaged. It's assessed 200% of its GDP. So we have seen what an existential threat in climate change now looks like. And we also can see the adverse impact of climate affecting every region of the Commonwealth. I recently witnessed myself the devastating trail and ruin left by Hurricane Irma and Maria in parts of the Caribbean. But I cannot forget the landslides in Sierra Leone, or the floods in Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Pakistan and India, or the fact that the Ring of Fire is lit again in the Pacific. And we should remember that we had Hurricane Ophelia in Ireland, and we had orange skies here in London because of the Sahara. So no one of us is left untouched by what is now happening. And such weather patterns are complex. And while we may see increased incidents of flooding in September, there have been negative impacts on water security. As things become more unpredictable, we've got cross-regional sustainable land and water management practices aligned with improved approaches to water quality and consumption will become ever more critical to the successful coordination of climate-resilient action. And the associated impacts of extreme weather, particularly on food security, because of reduced crop production yields, and to human health through risks such as malaria, are also of grave concern. So demographic growth is, of course, another serious dimension of the climate change challenge. The destructive impact of the anthropogenic climate change on the delicate balance of life on this planet poses an existential threat to many of our communities, and in some cases, as we now know, to entire countries. And that is why tackling climate change is a priority for collective action for our 52 member states. So although the shock from recent extreme weather is fresh and immediate and painful, this is not a new or unexpected crisis. The Commonwealth has always been in the vanguard of action on climate change, and thus the understanding of the extent of the impending threat first dawned in the Commonwealth a very long time ago. It's almost 30 years since in our Langkawi Declaration of 1989, the Commonwealth nations collectively expressed deep concern at the threat posed by serious deterioration in the environment, and they warned this, and I quote, "Any delay in taking action to halt this progressive deterioration will result in permanent and irreversible damage." And in 2009, at their summit in Port of Spain, our leaders signed the Port of Spain Climate Change Consensus, the Commonwealth Climate Change Declaration. And the Commonwealth has continued to be in the vanguard of raising awareness and working with international community on the practical ways towards mitigation and adaptation. And resilience is a strength we seek to build in the Commonwealth as a defence against the vulnerabilities resulting from geographic, economic, social, political, or human factors. So resilience can be built using the regenerative model of development. And we have spent the last 18 months carefully working in consultation with our member states and with a broad array of scientists from many disciplines and other specialties. And we have convened 3 meetings to listen to and consider the needs of our citizens and to devise an innovative and synthesized approach building on the Commonwealth Advantage in innovative ways to respond to those needs. And our determination has been to find a holistic solutions and to work together towards a common future based on the Commonwealth Charter and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which by definition leave no one behind. As our understanding has evolved, the regenerative model for building resilience to climate change has emerged, including specific expressions of collective commitment such as the Commonwealth Blue Charter. Ecosystems form critical building blocks which assist us in building resilience together, and coral reefs, so vulnerable to increased storms, perform an essential flood protection. And the ecological protection of land and river catchment help us to ensure water security and guard against land degradation and drought. And from this recognition grows the concept of regenerative development, which encompasses our belief that climate adaptation and resilience must be bottom-up, placing people and ecosystems, service and function at its very core. And this has to be the heart of our delivery programme on climate change. Over the coming months, we will be working in partnership with others to build proof of this concept towards a demonstration of examples of regenerative development on the ground and in practice. And we will focus particularly on those aspects of regenerative development which help us to move forward the human security and related dimensions of climate change. And we will place the climate resilience of our communities at the core of all of our work. And this offers pathways to sustainable prosperity and progress, and is firmly based in our Commonwealth philosophy and ethos. And the aim is for development without depletion, with reciprocity between human needs and the balance of our natural environment. It's consistent with the Commonwealth Charter principles, which include environmental protection, preservation, and conservation of natural ecosystems, and social equity and economic progress as factors in sustainable development. And the Charter calls for adaptation and mitigation actions and the generation and adoption of clean technology and waste management strategies, all of which are elements of regenerative development. And Article 10 of the Commonwealth Charter, headed Protecting the Environment, reads thus: "We recognise the importance of the protection and conservation of our natural ecosystems and affirm that sustainable management of the natural environment is the key to sustained human development. We recognise the importance of multilateral cooperation, sustained commitment and collective action, in particular by addressing the adaptation and mitigation challenges of climate change and facilitating the development, diffusion and deployment of affordable, environmentally friendly technologies and renewable energy, and the prevention of illicit dumping of toxic and hazardous waste, as well as the prevention and mitigation of erosion and desertification. So by working to conserve biological biodiversity and reverse land degradation, regenerative development creates sustainable development and sustainable investment opportunities across the whole of the Commonwealth. And these are likely to play an increasingly important part in supporting Commonwealth countries towards meeting commitments under the Paris Agreement and towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And we need to be acutely aware of the complexity of the climate change challenge, which may at times seem overwhelming. There is so much science. There are so many actors, so many interventions, and potential risks. And that's why the convening role of the Commonwealth is so important, and why we remain resolute in our approaches and calculated interventions. So too is our Commonwealth commitment to working and acting in partnership with others. and remaining focused on how, through our distinctive strengths, we can make a difference. We need to know when it is our role to assist, when it is to support, and when it is to enable. To broaden support for sustainable development, we are exploring the feasibility of compiling a vulnerability index. And this would deepen understanding of the need to reform the eligibility criteria for multilateral funding, particularly as they affect the middle-income countries that are vulnerable to environmental and economic shocks. And we are also pioneering the development and use of the innovative financial tools, including risk insurance and catastrophe bonds and other event-linked securities. So although the international community has pledged billions to address climate change, countries find it extremely difficult to draw from those financing mechanisms, such as the Green Climate Fund, for projects to actually help people adapt to climate change and mitigate its effect. So our Commonwealth Climate Finance Access Hub, based in Mauritius, helps countries untangle the red tape around climate financing so that they can make successful applications to the international funds that address climate change. And the hub assists member states with human and institutional capacity building, enabling them to unlock funding for mitigation and adaptation that they would not otherwise be able to reach. And we're examining and preparing some emerging jurisprudential challenges posed in some of our Commonwealth jurisdictions by the rising sea levels as a result of climate change. Loss of territory and displacement of population could have far-reaching effects on many aspects of international law, particularly on our large ocean states, whose marine areas often exceed their terrestrial space. So securing limits of national jurisdiction by negotiating maritime boundaries, establishing these limits on international charts and informing the international community of these limits are some of the ways we support low-lying member states. And we will continue to advocate and seek consensus on various means of preventing displacement of communities due to sea level rise resulting from climate change. And it's in these smaller and more vulnerable communities and nations whose security and welfare are likely to be most threatened that we must work to protect. So consensus reached at our most recent Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in 2015 in Malta immediately preceded COP21. I think it helped pave the way towards the Paris Agreement, because in Malta we agreed 1, enforceability, 2, 2 degrees, and 3, that it should be an aspirational target of 1.5, and that helped in Paris. So the Commonwealth action on climate change was reaffirmed in the leader's statement on climate action, which underlined the importance of practical and swift action to reinforce outcomes from COP21, especially for climate-vulnerable states and communities. And when Commonwealth leaders meet in London next April, we will again be considering practical action to tackle climate change, to protect the environment and increase the resilience of our members through sustainable development in accordance with our Commonwealth Charter. 45 of our members are ocean states, and so SDG 14 is of particular significance for the Commonwealth. At the Oceans Conference, I heard that it was suggested that the Commonwealth has 78% of our oceans. So we have recently been re-examining our Commonwealth values and principles through a blue lens, looking at how they relate to the health of our oceans and the protection of its ecological integrity and the restoration of its resilience. And as a result, we are working towards a Commonwealth Blue Charter of principles for sustainable ocean development so that unlocking economic value from the seas is married with the imperative of protecting the environment and with the recognition that ocean wealth depends on ocean health. And we've been providing technical support to assist countries manage ocean resources for 3 decades. And this new Commonwealth Blue Charter will take up the principles and values of the Commonwealth Charter and apply them to ocean governance. And it will carry forward long-standing Commonwealth engagement and expert assistance with a view to helping countries towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, particularly their Goal 14, commitment to conserve and sustainably use the oceans, the seas, and the marine resources. And the recent climatic events across the Commonwealth have highlighted the close linkage between the oceans, land, the environment, and the well-being of people, as exemplified by SDG 13, 14, and the other interlinked SDGs. So once implemented, the Commonwealth Blue Charter will allow member states to identify priority areas for action to address these challenges and opportunities, and to participate in knowledge exchanges in marine policy, science, and other areas relevant to balancing ocean protection and production priorities. So sustainable development of national maritime industries and securing a proper return from exploitation of marine resources can be transformational in its impact on national development. And at the Commonwealth Secretariat, we are building up an in-house team of experts to support member states with this. And Commonwealth countries are already at the cutting edge of examining them, notably some of our Pacific Island members, which face particular development challenges and vulnerabilities. So seabed minerals may offer a new source of national income, yet many of the same countries suffer severe capacity constraints and may have limited successful experience of regulating extractive industries. And that is why we at the Commonwealth Secretariat are engaging with the University of Southampton on opportunities arising from the new frontier of seabed mineral exploration. In a current project building on scientific work recently undertaken at the University of Southampton, we are helping the government of Kiribati to develop a world-leading regulatory framework for management of seabed minerals, and to move towards being considered as large ocean states rather than small island developing states, or SIDS, will require careful and informed decision-making, and making the most of what one of our heads described as the opportunity to be nimble, quick, and cost-effective. So beyond bilateral country assistance, we are convening Commonwealth groupings for knowledge sharing and mutual support. In August, we held our first Commonwealth meeting on the International Seabed Authority in Jamaica. And in recent days, my team have been in New York convening a meeting of African countries to support their engagement on seabed mineral issues on the international stage. And we're refining the model legal instruments to encourage debate and harmonization of approaches across the Commonwealth. And it is unusual for an industry to have received so much attention before it has commenced operations. And that it has, I think, provides an opportunity for Commonwealth member countries to convene and to agree at the very outset best practice policies and laws firmly based on Commonwealth Charter principles for sustainability, and recognising the importance of maintaining ocean health and the rights of Commonwealth citizens as resource owners. Inclusive and sustainable development is achieved by offering equitable opportunities to everyone to participate, and by drawing on the talents and contributions of all. Our Charter states that we are committed to equality and respect for the protection and promotion of civil, political, economic, social and cultural rights, including the right to development for all without discrimination on any grounds, as the foundation of peaceful, just and stable societies. And we note that these rights are universal, indivisible, interdependent and interrelated, and cannot be implemented selectively. And we are implacably opposed to all forms of discrimination, whether rooted in gender, race, colour, creed, political belief or other grounds. So we cannot think of progress towards achieving the broader goals of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development without thinking about overcoming prejudice and discrimination of any kind, or working for gender equality and including people of all ages. In our Commonwealth way of working, we accord high priority to the involvement of youth in decision-making and in shaping the future of their communities and the world in which they live, learn and work. So across the Commonwealth, young people are exemplars and eloquent advocates of positive change, and gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls through education and social and economic inclusion are also vital factors in being responsive to the ambitions and aspirations of all our citizens. And there is a strong correlation between increasing the capacity of women to engage in economic enterprise and wider empowerment of women for leadership that will lead to achieving gender equality and sustainable development. And therefore, through Commonwealth programmes and technical assistance, we are working to increase the participation of women in corporate decision-making at all levels. And I hope priorities such as this and the range of other examples I have offered demonstrate the potency and potential of Commonwealth's convening power. When we come together to plan and take collective action for the common good. So we must cherish the Commonwealth Advantage that is offered through our ability to convene and brigade such diversity, and rally it in new ways to mobilise international cooperation as we face a fragile and uncertain global future. It is up to all of us, Commonwealth citizens and governments, institutions and universities in member states, in partnership with friends and neighbours in the wider international community, to understand its potential, to use it and make the most of its promise. We can, if we choose, by working together, deliver the Sustainable Development Goals. But it will take all of us. And the Commonwealth is choosing. I just hope the rest of the world will choose with us too. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Baroness Scotland. Hugely powerful speech and real optimism about the power of working together, which I think we would all very sincerely endorse. And I'm sure there'll be questions around that in the panel to follow. So thank you. Our next speaker, and welcome Gwen, is Gwen Hines, Director of International Relations at the UK Department for International Development. And Gwen will talk on the subject of fast-tracking progress on the SDGs. Gwen Hines has worked for the UK government since 1996 in a range of policy and operational positions. Before taking up the role at DFID, International Relations Director, she was the UK government's Executive Director to the World Bank Group from 2012 to 2015. She has also served at the DFID head office in Bangladesh and in Malawi, and worked on the DFID programme in Pakistan. Throughout her career, Gwen has worked on international relations, including with UN agencies, the World Trade Organization, and the G7 and G8, specializing in African issues. She was seconded by DFID as a national expert to the European Commission, and that was DG DevCo. Gwen has also worked for the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office and for Apple Computers, and completed an internship at the US House of Representatives. Her academic background is in politics, economics, and psychology. Gwen, welcome.
Thanks very much. Yes, please. Thank you very much, and it's a real pleasure to be here today. And thank you to Baroness Scotland, who set out a very compelling, very ambitious, positive vision, which I certainly share, and I hope all of you do. And you'll have heard from my background, a lot of my life is working with other countries to talk about shared priorities and how we come together. And I think we should all be proud of how the Commonwealth is coming together. Thank you. To show real leadership on these issues around sustainability, resilience, looking after the poorer, smaller states, which is so important. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit. So I wanted to talk about accelerating progress. These are the global goals. I've mixed them up a little bit, just in case you all start learning them in order. But there are 17. There's 169 targets. It's a very, very important agenda, but it's also a huge agenda. I'm impatient for change. My heart is in the village in Africa, in Malawi, where I spent 3 years trying to accelerate progress there. In the last few years of the Millennium and Development Goals running up to 2015, there was a huge global push on how we could do better, which were the goals left behind, like maternal mortality. Frankly, all the gender goals were the ones furthest behind, which tells us a lot. The danger now is we agree a new agenda, 2015, we talk about 2030. That feels like a long time away, especially from a political perspective. And everyone thinks, oh, great, so we celebrate for a year that we agreed this new agenda. Brilliant. But we're now 2 years on, and time is already running out. It is a huge agenda, and we need to keep focusing on how do we accelerate progress. Because this matters. This matters to the people in the village. It matters to the states who are seeing sea levels rise and are going to disappear if we're not careful. And it matters with the challenges we see day in, day out. Conflict is something I'll talk about a bit more. So I want to talk about how we speed up progress. And since we're sponsored by Southampton University, I'm going to give you a few bits of data as well. So why does it matter? Is this really a big deal? Well, for those who were there, and the British Prime Minister, David Cameron at the time, some of my team were there. They fought for 2 years for this agenda. They negotiated it, they worked with everybody else, and they will tell you just how important it is. They had a sign up the day after that said, we did it, thank you world. And they feel passionately about it. And it is genuinely an attempt to say we are the first generation in history who could actually end extreme poverty. We could do that. But as Baroness Scotland said, it's huge. It's going to take a lot of work. And we have made a lot of progress. But we talk about in DFID, we've done the easy bits. We have made massive progress on reducing child mortality, on reducing poverty. Anyone who tells you that we haven't made progress is wrong. There's fantastic progress. But now we've got the really tough bits to do. And as fast as we try and move forward, other challenges come, like climate change, like conflict, like health security, other issues. But we could do that. And I think the other important point is the 5 Ps. The idea, as Baroness Scotland said, that we balance the needs of people, the planet, prosperity. It's really important. You need money, you need development, you need jobs. We need peace. And fundamentally, we have to work in partnerships. And the one really different thing about the SDGs is to work in partnership and work in new coalitions that cut across governments, private sector, citizens, all sorts of institutions. There are new goals. By the time we got to 2015, we were all talking a lot about governance and economic development, but there weren't goals. It didn't really matter because we still did it, but it was important to reflect those goals. Gender comes across very, very strongly, and it was one of the goals we as the UK fought hardest for, is a standalone goal on gender, but gender cuts through. And if you read the wording, it says we cannot achieve any of these goals if we don't put gender at the heart. They're comprehensive, they're indivisible. Again, we'll come back to some of the challenges of that. But they're universal. They apply to the UK as much as to everybody else. But with that universality comes a commitment to leave no one behind. Again, when people do recognise progress has been made, they say, oh, it's great, we could drop $1 a day poverty, because actually it's not relevant anymore. If you live in Congo, it's very, very relevant. It's still 80% of the population. When I lived in Malawi, it was 75%. You go a kilometre outside the capital, Lilongwe, people live in mud huts. The classes have 200 kids. And they don't have any desks, they don't have any lighting, they don't have any books. So there are some places in the world being left behind, and there are some groups in some countries being left behind. It also talked about modernising development finance. So again, the geeks in my team who know this stuff will talk about Agenda 2030. It's not just the goals, it's also the agreement on financing for development. It is COP that was agreed at the end of the year. It's the Sendai framework on dealing with disaster resilience. It's the World Trade Agreement. It's all these different things coming together. But it recognised very much it is about 0.7, and the UK should be very proud of that commitment to 0.7 that we have. We're the first big developed country to hit it. But it's about more than that. So DFID has just recapitalised CDC, our private sector investment arm, with several billion, because even if we spend 0.7, it's a lot of money. You'll hear it in the British press every day. It's a lot of money. Why is it not going elsewhere? It's a fraction of what we actually need to tackle development globally. We need the private sector too. We need to help countries benefit from trade. We need to help increase the tax take. When I was in Pakistan, we did a lot of work on helping the government to simplify the tax code, because actually only 10% of GDP is made up by tax, and only a minority of people pay tax, and not necessarily the wealthiest. So all these things are boring, but they're really, really important. We need to look at domestic resources. If you talk about health or education, it's not what we fund. DFID funds a lot of health and education, but the big money comes from domestic resources. And more will come from domestic resources. So how do we help work together on those things? And the private sector and its involvement, not just cash. If you sit with the private sector, the number one frustration is everyone thinks they're a checkbook. They have far more to offer on that. In the Caribbean reconstruction at the moment, as Baroness Scotland knows, a big debate is how are the tourism companies that work in that area able to help rebuild hope, rebuild confidence in that area. If we're going to do infrastructure in the way that is resilient to those kind of hurricanes, we need private sector expertise to do that. So what's the UK doing? I think we've had 6 parliamentary hearings so far. So just to reassure you, we are doing a lot. It is a cross-government approach. It was, in terms of the design of the goals, signing up to them. It remains so. We've just announced we're going to do our own voluntary national review, as all member states do, in 2019. We're not delaying because we're not wanting to do it. We're delaying because that is a year that focuses on governance. And that was one of the goals that we considered particularly important because it cuts across. So it'll give us plenty of time. And all of you, I hope, will be involved in thinking about what will the UK say about its progress. And it mustn't just be a government report. We produced one already, for those of you who can't wait, in March, which is on the GovUK website, about some of the things we're doing both domestically and internationally. Each department is integrating the global goals into their single departmental plan. Again, boring but important. This is a thing that all departments have, which they are held to account for delivering on, targets by both the Cabinet Office and the Treasury, and a new set about to be published. DFID has policy oversight, not because we know everything about everything, but because, again, a lot of the work to be done between now and 2030 is helping some of the poorest countries in the world where DFID works. But we work very closely with the Cabinet Office. Another really important element of the UK's approach is tracking progress. And the Office for National Statistics is a key part of that. And they've just launched a great online platform to enable you to track progress about what the UK is doing. And you'll see there, 43% of the indicators the UK already tracks and publishes online. They're working on another 20%. 37% we're still thinking about. If you do read every single indicator on the global goals, and believe me, I have, some of them are kind of hard to track. So there's going to be a real challenge. How do we globally track those? And again, where do we really put the effort? And I'll come back more to that, because you could spend a lot of time thinking about really interesting data questions. But again, the places where we really need better data are the countries which have the least data. So thinking about that as well. So we do a lot of work supporting statistics overseas, but also thinking about big data, digital. Again, when I was in Malawi, the official statistics were rubbish. But if you go to a health centre in a village, they have a sheet of paper. Births, deaths, of what's happened. It's all there. So it's finding new ways to collate that. So we're very focused on accelerating. This is just an example of some of the things that we've done in the UK and DFID in the last couple of years to try and show the world that we can make progress. I had the privilege of being part of the high-level panel on women's economic empowerment. Justine Greening set this up when she was DFID Secretary of State with Ban Ki-moon, UN Secretary General, and it ran through, and the new Secretary General, Guterres, is fundamentally committed to it as well. We even had a conference last week in Wilton Park working with British business, British civil society, how do we do more? And it was taking a new issue that was reflected in the global goals, and everyone was like, oh yeah, we'll do something, but what do we do? So the first report was a big review. Nobody needs to repeat it. We've paid for it. We've done the work. What does the evidence tell us, as Baroness Scotland says? What does work? What doesn't work? What do we think might work, but we're not really sure yet, so you need to do a bit more research. So that was a global review of the proven and the promising. And it also came up with a clear strategy of 7 sets of drivers you need to focus on to really make progress, from tackling norms to the role that companies can play as employers, but also what they buy through their supply chains, what government can do in setting the right policies, regulations, but again, as employers and as procurers. So I recommend you have a look at that. But there's many other things we've done. And we're trying to show family planning, for example, was one where the international discussion on family planning was heading in the wrong direction. But again, as Baroness Scotland said, demographics are so fundamentally important. We're often asked, why does DFID focus so much on Africa? Well, Africa is the only region whose population is increasing, and it's going to double. And that's not just about cultural issues. That's, again, I can tell you the women in Malawi wanted family planning. It's a logistical challenge as much as anything. How do we get the family planning to the last mile? How do we support girls to stay in school? How do we deal with those who are married off far too young? So all those issues are really important. So we decided as a UK that we could show leadership on this. We could pull people together. And it's the kind of thing I'm really proud of. And we're going to be doing the same on disability, summer 2018. 1 billion people in the world are disabled. 80% are in developing countries. Very rarely talked about internationally. Really is neglected. So let's get some movement on that issue. So, numbers and stats. DFID has a lot of economists. Conflict and fragility is really important. It's one of those examples of an issue which is holding back progress. It's not at all surprising that the 4 famines we had last year, unprecedented famines, were in countries in conflict. It's not at all surprising that Congo is one of those with some of the poorest communities. There are exceptions. Malawi doesn't have conflict. But by the time Malawi's population has tripled, if we haven't tackled the food supply, if we haven't tackled the other issues, you may see conflict. So these issues are really important. And that's a heat map. And the UK is committed to spend 50% of our aid in fragile conflict states because we think this is so important. Now, when I sat on the World Bank board, my colleagues, many from developing countries, said, you're mad. Why are you doing this? Let's wait for the conflicts to finish and then go in. Well, the reality is the bulk of conflicts now last 10, 20 years. That's the new reality. If you look at the work we're all doing in Jordan and Lebanon, Lebanon is hosting more Syrian kids than Lebanese kids in its schools. And if we don't educate those kids now, that'll be a lost generation. So the nature of the way we work and deal with fragility is fundamentally shifted and is incredibly important. And all these other issues like climate change, food scarcity will lead to more conflict in the future. So it's all very interlinked. Another one for you. Don't worry too much about it. It's a very busy chart. But the point is this interlinkage between the different global goals. And some really interesting work begun to be done. And we've been working with some researchers who are doing this for a number of countries to think about, right, how does it work in a particular country? Because if you're the finance minister, the development minister, the president in the country, which of the 169 targets do you start with? It's really important. I can tell you in DFID, the health advisor will say health, the education advisor will say education. We're working hard on getting past those silos. But these kind of maps that look at relationships are really important. Just an example, energy. Energy is really important to everything we do, including growth, including health, schooling. We had a minister a few years ago, and we showed him a chart, the world at night. The only region in the world that's dark is Africa. Now, in London, people get very, very stressed about street lighting. I spend lots of time blackout blinds trying to keep my kids asleep. But in places in the world, including Malawi, it's light at 5, it's dark at 5. And the world revolves around that. My 10-year-old still gets up at 5. It's my fault. But it's really important, because if you're a kid who goes to school in the morning, walks 10 kilometers, then comes home, has to work for the family, when do you do reading? If you can get a book, because it's dark and there is literally no power. When I was in Malawi, I had 128 megawatts. That's less than a small town in the UK. It's just not enough. What happens in the hospital, people in intensive care, when the power goes out because the generator runs out of fuel? Power is so fundamental, and of course what happens is people use wood and they burn it inside, and then they get all sorts of lung infections, and it costs a fortune. So getting power, getting sustainable power across the world is incredibly important. Think what a change it made in the UK many, many decades ago. So the Sustainable Energy for All, the badge up there, is a really good example of a new coalition that cuts across government, across private sector, across citizens, philanthropists trying to tackle this. Another very busy chart, don't worry too much about it. But again, just to show some of the interesting work that's going in to say, right, if you can't track 169, which might you track? So which have the greatest impact on others? Now, I haven't been through this with a fine-tooth comb. I don't know if I agree with it. But it is looking at relationships between them and saying, the proposal is if you track those different goals and indicators, you'll have a good sense of what's going on in your country. And sometimes that's because they're bellwether indicators that show you all sorts of other things. If you're doubling agricultural productivity, you're doing much better on education, you're doing better on water supply, you're doing better on all these other things as well, because that is the outcome level. Water, sanitation, hygiene gets really ignored again internationally. But if you want to improve health outcomes, that's what you need to do. Open defecation, again, not an easy thing to talk about, but is one of India's biggest challenges. It lies behind a lot of the poor nutrition, lies behind a lot of the diarrhea, and is incredibly important. And President Modi is trying to have a big push. And again, it's not building toilets. That's the easy bit. It's behaviour change, and how you get that behaviour change from the village level up, again, as Baroness Scotland said, is really important. So some interesting work like this begins to help us to unpack that myriad of different issues and things we're trying to deal with. Another bit of research. Can you only make progress if you're better off? We have endless debates in DFID between the economists and the others. Do you need to get rich before you deal with these things? And again, it's part of the global debate. Why are you asking me to think about these issues of green energy I'm still developing? But there's some interesting work that's going into, yes, there's a very, very strong relationship between your level of income and the progress you're making. Again, Malawi, because I know the numbers really well, they're burned into my heart. The finance minister had $120 per citizen per year. Aid and government money, and aid's about half the budget. That's it. So people will come to me, brilliant ideas. I've got this brilliant idea. I can deal with cancer in Malawi, 10,000 a head. Well, we just can't do it. Actually, there was a brilliant charity that could do it for $100 for about 50% of child cancers. And yes, we couldn't deal with the other 50%, but that kind of model, which works in different countries. Organisations like BRAC in Bangladesh have some of the best education outcomes for a fraction of what it costs other people. So having those models that work at different stages of development and which are cost effective is really important. And that's not me being a penny pincher with DFID's budget. This is saying this is a reality. If you have to pay for everything in the government for $120, you need solutions that work for your stage of development. And of course you need more money. But there will never be enough money to design a perfect system, so you need to think about that. So that's the basic relationship. But then look at this. US is way off track where it should be. Russia's way off track. India's off track, and they're off track on different things, although Russia and America both off track on violence and self-harm, which is kind of interesting about where the society is going. Here are the positive ones. Further ahead, far further ahead of where you'd think they'd be. So Maldives, got some interesting statistics. Morocco. And you find this when you sit internationally. And again, as coming back to Baroness Scotland, it's getting countries together to say, hey, you've got something really interesting going on in your country. How are you doing now? What's working? Why? So big focus on South-South learning, but it's not just South-South. It's all of us coming together. I've got a brilliant partnership with Brazil. We had them over recently. So we've done a lot of work with Brazil to take their cash transfer program, social protection, and their agricultural work to Africa. Because actually, they know far more about what's going to work in Africa than I do. So helping to do those different partnerships, what can we learn from that? What can you learn by bringing 4 or 5 different countries together is really important. So understanding these surprising facts is very important. Final slide. Leave no one behind. I said I'd come back to this. Again, this is where my heart is. There's so many things we can do internationally. But if we really want to make a difference in the way the global goals committed, we need to focus on those furthest behind. Because with the Millennium Development Goals, they talked about global halving of poverty. Now, frankly, you could do that almost through China alone. And if you look at the numbers, actually aid was not what did that. That was China that did a lot of that. But when you come to aid, aid is for the poorest. Aid is a catalyst to other things. Aid is something which, if we do it really well, can leverage change, not on its own at all. But if we put our effort into those furthest behind, then we really are living up to our values. So we've got a very strong commitment. This is the heart of DFID's work. DFID likes to pick the challenges that other people aren't doing. It's why we're going to focus on disability, because we just feel it's neglected. It's why we're working in fragile states. But just a couple of other examples. We've been partnering with development initiatives and a few others on this P20 initiative to track the 20% poorest people in the world. And actually, you see there, they're the bulk of the cases of stunting, unregistered births. So all sorts of things. If we're really trying to make a dent internationally in the numbers, you actually need to start with that bottom 20%. Global push on disability, and sorry, my slide went slightly mad there, but again, 1 billion people, 80% in developing countries, and a quote there from the new Secretary of State at DFID last week when she launched this plan for a summit. And again, we're talking to Baroness Scotland about how we can get this as a value, as an issue across the Commonwealth, because many countries in the Commonwealth have got a great story to tell on this. So how do we get people together and say, enough, this is 1 billion people? In the way we have on gender, not too many years ago, people said gender was a minority issue, and I spent my life saying, hello, it's 50% of the population. It's not really a minority. But we've made a lot of progress on gender. We're not finished. There's still a long way to go. But where are the next set of issues? And can we use disability as a wedge issue, frankly, to then tackle a whole range of other issues? But it's something where there are solutions. We have a brilliant program across the Commonwealth tackling preventable blindness, trachoma. We can eliminate trachoma in a few Commonwealth countries. We don't have it in the UK. It's actually quite easy to deal with through medication. But getting it out there is really important, and it takes this partnership coming together. We've nearly eradicated polio. I know we've been talking about it for a long time, and we always think we're nearly there, but we are genuinely closer than we have ever been. So we can eradicate some of these problems to free up space to deal with the new ones. But if we really want to make the difference, let's live up to leave no one behind. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gwen, particularly for confronting us with the data. And as an engineer feeling a little bit out of my depth, I am reassured when I see an eigenvector up there. It is all soluble if you can put an eigenvector to it. Finally, our third speaker, please join me in welcoming Professor Sybren Drijfhout, Professor in Physical Oceanography and Climate Physics at the University of Southampton, who will talk on the subject of extreme sea level rise, the greatest threat from global warming for the UK. Sybren Drijfhout is a professor in physical oceanography and climate physics within ocean and earth science at the National Oceanography Centre in Southampton and at the University of Southampton. Sybren's research revolves around the role of the ocean in climate change and vice versa, the impact of climate change on the ocean, in particular the stability of the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation and abrupt climate change. Sybren's research methods include the use of ocean and climate models to study the impact of climate change. Sybren, welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon. When I was invited to speak here, my first reaction, being a physicist, was anything I can deliver is out of tune with the main theme and the framing of this conference. But the organization kept urging me and say, please deliver your dissonant. So that's what I'm going to do. The relation between global warming and sea level rise. What I'm going to tell you now is that the story is far worse than we all tend to believe up till now. And the IPCC scenarios will be severely upgraded. About a year ago, our scientific community was startled by a new publication in the journal Nature by two American scientists. If the results of that publication were correct, then all the scenarios made by the IPCC or by the UK Met Office could be trashed in the dustbin. Let me give you a few of the main points. And the first one is something that is not from their study. It's well known, but not outside the physical community. Even if tomorrow we are completely carbon neutral, even if after tomorrow global mean temperature will not rise with a centigrade, then still sea level will continue to rise. And I'm not talking about centimeters nor decimeters, but much more. If the processes that these two scientists included in their model really work, then there is no safe way out, for sure. Even if we meet the objectives of Paris, and I'm very skeptical that we will be able to do so, we cannot exclude 3 to 4 meters sea level rise. But if we don't do anything, we are very sure that we will go into the abyss. 10 to 20 meters in a few hundred years. And already in 2200, half of that. And now suddenly it becomes within reach, because that means that Edinburgh and Eastern London may have much less future than history. No country, nor the United Nations or any supranational body, is prepared for 5 to 6 meters. Shouldn't we think about plan B? Okay, let's go to the facts. So I have to warn you, this is going to be a little bit a science talk, but I'll try to make it accessible to even people that study psychology or economics or whatever. The upper graph, if you, I have to really look to the ceiling. Let me see whether this works. So I'm going to do something new. I'm going to use graphs and a laser pointer. What we see here is sea level rise, globally averaged, as measured by satellites and Drijfhout. And what we see is an acceleration. It started with something like 8 millimeters per year. It's now more than 3 millimeters per year. And this is an enlargement of the last year, so measured by satellites. And if you believe that this isn't natural variability, then you see a steepening up to something like 4 millimeters per year, 40 centimeters. Where do all these meters come from if we only see 40 centimeters? And our sea level rise comes from melting ice caps, but not so many, glaciers, and especially expansion due to the warming of the seawater. Okay. This is the challenge because we couldn't get it working outside my own laptop, but let's give it a try. What you will see here is what I call the temperature spiral, developed by a colleague from Reading, and a sea level spiral. And this is just to illustrate something that puts the Paris Agreement and the 1.5 degree century temperature rise in perspective. Let's see whether it works. Yeah, it works. Great. So this is the anomaly with respect to the pre-industrial area. So it starts with 0 and then it spirals out because we're getting warmer and warmer. Similar thing for sea level. I take Florida because that is quite representative for the globe as a whole. Well, what do we see? And this is quite important. This is pretty close to 1.5 degree, isn't it? So it was next year. Now there is a debate, should we start in 1850 or 1880? Should we take a linear trend? So when is it 1.5 degree warmer? And scientists can debate for months, a year about it. 1.5 degree, 40 centimeters. Where do all these meters come from? What we see is a planet that is not in equilibrium. So let's go back to somewhat slower time scales. These are the ice ages, with swings between glacial and interglacials. This is sea level, CO2, temperature, all very well correlated. 100 meters, sea level. Let's go to the temperature. 6 degrees. So that is the equilibrium response. 100 meters for every 6 degrees. 60 meters per degree. Now I'm cheating a little bit. In the ice age, we have ice on Eurasia and on America, where the ice sheets can contract and expand much faster than in the present state. So this number is higher for a colder climate. So we can make a similar estimate from the geological data for the present day climate. We have some climates that were quite close to it. Then we come to a guess of around 6 meters per degree temperature rise. So even if we manage to constrain global warming to 1.5 degree, committed sea level rise is 10 meters. Now, what is the paradigm shift? We already knew this. Nobody ever asks us about this, and we don't deliver it in our scenarios, which only go 100 years ahead. But this is the story. The story we always thought is this is going to take 3,000 years. And then nobody in this room, no politician, no one in the media or the public is interested what's going to happen in 3,000 years. The paradigm shift is that we now think it might happen in 200 years. And then it becomes another story. This is the most complicated one, but I'll try to guide you through it. So what are the processes? Think of Antarctica as a souffle you put in the oven. And when you put it out, it wants to collapse, unless you're a very good cook. Antarctica is in the middle, 3 or more kilometers high. And at the edges it's very small, and it wants to subside. And the thing that prevents it from collapsing are what we call the floating ice shelves. Over here. They are the buttresses of the cathedral. Now what is happening, and we already knew this in the last IPCC report, but it didn't get in. is these floating ice shelves are melted from below by the warming ocean, and changes also in the currents which bring more water to the continental shelf over there. This point here is what we call a grounding line. This is grounded ice, this is floating ice. So if floating ice melts, sea level doesn't rise, but if grounding ice disappears, it does. So also if grounding ice is transported to the floating ice shelf, you rise sea level. Now the flow from grounded ice to floating ice is proportional to the height above the grounding line. So what happens when you have a little bit of extra ocean melting? Grounding line will move land inwards. And the point is in Antarctica we have almost, at many places we have a downward sloping bedrock. So then automatically it becomes larger. So once this is started by a little bit of extra ocean warming, you will get a larger flow which will drive the grounding line even more inward. It's a self-propelling mechanism. Many of these grounding lines just rest on a little ridge or hill. And that's where they ended up. But now with global warming, we're pushing them over the hill, and then it becomes unstoppable. This is what we all agree on that is important. It's now in all ice sheet models, and it will double our previous estimates. But the extra meters come from two different other processes. The floating ice shelves are at the boundaries of Antarctica, where it's most warm. So in the summer, you have temperatures above zero. You form melt ponds. These melt ponds erode the ice. They form cracks and crevices. And the same goes from the warm water below. It also forms from below crevices. And if you have enough of them, of these rifts, the whole thing explodes. There is no shelf anymore. And then suddenly, oh, the wrong knob. And then suddenly you have a cliff. And if the cliff is too high, it will collapse under its own weight. And because land inwards will come higher and higher, if this starts, it won't stop anymore. And we see this happening. So in 1997 or 8, an ice shelf called Larsen A collapsed. This is Larsen B in 2002, as if you've thrown an atomic bomb on the ice shelf. This is as large as Rhode Island, a bit larger than Wales. This is again Antarctica. I have a colleague who had an ice model, and then he said, we went with the ship to an area where in our model of Antarctica, there were no melting ponds. It was always dry in the model. And then I came there and what I saw was a Niagara waterfall coming down. So it melts like hell. It forms deep canyons. It's slightly less large than the Grand Canyon, but this is a few hundred meters deep and maybe a kilometer wide. This is Larsen C, south of Larsen A and B that already exploded. A big crack was progressing. In 10 years it did the yellow trajectory. Then in 3 years it did this part, and then in 3 months it finished. This is what is now completely released from this larger ice shelf. It is not yet the start of the total collapse. The rest is still stable, but if it wants to collapse, it should start like this. So floating ice shelves themselves do not rise, do not raise the sea level. Think of melting ice cubes in your glass of tonic or gin tonic if you prefer alcohol. But they cause a huge increase in the Kelvin. So we have seen behind Larsen A and B that these Kelvin estimates rates go up with a factor of 5 or 10. And if you realize that the Kelvin in equilibrium balances the snowfall, and that we start with maybe 10% imbalance, that if that total amount is then increased with a factor 10, the contribution to sea level rise will increase with a factor of 100. First, the buttresses tumble down, then the cathedral. We're not there with the cathedral, but we see the buttresses going. So this is the model. This is the longer term perspective. And you see black, blue and red lines. They are so-called RCP scenarios, but you won't know what they are. So I put, or most of you, warming scenario. So 1.5 is black, 2.5 is blue, 4.5 is red. Now with the black one, nothing happens. And this is irrealistic, and I'll explain in a minute why. The blue one is 2.5 degrees. That's something, okay, let me explain later. 2.5 degrees, 6 meters in 2,500, 2 meters in 2,200. The red one is 4.5 degrees. We used to call it business as usual, and nowadays among our colleague scientists we call this the Trump scenario. All these are so-called tipping points where certain glaciers become unstable and start to contribute. This means 6 centimeters per year times 100, and then you know what you get in a century. At this moment, our emission pathway is somewhere between the blue and the red one, but closer to the red one than the blue one. And if we implement everything we promised in Paris, we will go slightly down, but we'll still be above the blue one. So Paris is by far not enough to fulfill its own goals. This is why I don't believe that the black one is so secure. Because what they did is they made their model in equilibrium with the present day forcing, and then they started global warming. But Antarctica isn't in equilibrium with the present day forcing. And so what you see here is that it's gaining mass, contrary to what we observe. Because first it collects more snow, and nothing is melting or is increasing the iceberg calving. But then suddenly the ice shelves become unstable. And this is the present day trend, the green line. And what you see is suddenly the trend becomes almost 30 to 50 times as large. So there is no time to react hardly. When we see it, it's too late. This is a little bit to stress the former point. So this is what we see in terms of mass loss for Antarctica. It's losing mass, and that amount of mass loss is quickly increasing. It's almost exponential. We already know that a few of these ice shelves have crossed a tipping point. There are a few that discharge in the Amundsen Sea, which is just southwest of the peninsula. They are 400 meters deep, but they are losing 20 meters a year. So after 20 years, they're gone. And if we force our model with the observed ocean temperatures, then also this whole ice sheet in that part is going away. So this is what it means in terms of scenarios. Yeah, standard modest scenario, something like 40 centimeters. This is a Dutch scenario, but it's the same as the English one. The red one maybe goes to 70. But if we believe that these processes that we observe and that were included in that American model work, then we get suddenly an estimate of 2 meters. With this uncertainty range. This is still a worst case scenario. So we don't know the likelihood of this scenario yet. In Holland, we are worried. Unlike Britain, we can't afford any flooding because then suddenly the whole country drowns. So we have to have 100% protection. Well, maybe you have maybe 3% protection. So there was a hackathon of a big engineering institute in civil engineering. They called it a hackathon. That is, they want to hack a problem with 30 people. Can we cope with 6 meter sea level rise? And the answer is yes. Our engineers say the sky is the limit. Don't ask us what it costs, but we can do it. And there were 3 scenarios. Make it a fort. And then pump all the rivers over the wall. It sounds science fiction, but it is serious. Or keep on raising the dikes. But you get a problem because the Rhine, which is entering Holland and near the German boundary, at present has a slope of 6 meters when you go to the sea. So if the sea level rises, it doesn't flow anymore. So you have to bring it to a lake which you pump lower than the sea, and then you pump it, and so the ice lake, into the sea. Or just say we take some sort of natural boundary, we give up the west, and maybe a few cities that have some sort of historical or touristic importance, we try to protect them. So I will say we will have our tourists going in the east with boats to Amsterdam with the slogan, sex on the bottom of the sea, you've never experienced it before. This costs £500 billion. I remember we had these floodings in the UK in 2014, and then John Mayer said, we will prevent this happening again. I'm going to invest several millions. And we in Holland, we fell off our chair from laughing. This is Holland with 5 meters. So we are in big trouble. Also England, the Thames, the water may go around the Thames barrier, Portsmouth, this area, Edinburgh. Also England has something to fight for. And already the floodings that we experience now completely are the same areas as that become completely flooded with 5 meters. But it's not only a UK or a Holland problem. It's a bigger problem. It's a global problem, a UN problem. The color is how much of each country populated, weighted, will become lower than the sea level when we get all these meters. And the most important thing is, you see here the mega cities. Especially the mega cities are going to suffer. And this is where 600 million people live. In these cities. A lot in India and Bangladesh, but also in India itself. A lot in China, Japan, Vietnam. Africa a little less, but I always say this is going to be a big problem too. There are at present 40 million people living in the Nile Delta. And if they can't live here anymore, they're not going to the east, nor to the west, nor to the south. So if we are not doing something, really something about this problem, we are going to witness in the next century massive migration of the same amount as we had in Europe in the 4th to 6th century, which meant the end of the Roman Empire. So, after all those messages of hope, let me give you a little sparkle of hope in the end, but especially a warning. So we have to do something, otherwise we're sure that we're running into big problems. Maybe 50 meters in 2500, 6 meters in 2200. No country is prepared for this. If we become carbon neutral in 2100, we still have to face numbers that we don't like to face. So there may be a safe space of safe limit for temperature rise, but the associated sea level rise isn't safe. Oops. Our only hope is really doing Paris. Even if we're not sure it's going to help. But it's our only chance. And we have to fight for our chance. And even if it doesn't help on the very long term, it may retard the sea level rise. It may prevent certain tipping points to occur already in this century. It's still a worst case scenario. We still don't know whether it's really going to happen this fast as in this model. Probably a little later and a little less. But even with half of this, we're still facing enormous challenges. So we have to think about a plan B, not only the UK, not only Holland, but also all the countries that will suffer from this. So this also should be a United Nations plan B.
But there I was getting all optimistic with the sight of an eigenvector, and now I see data and I'm not so sure. If I could, I'm about to change hats, so if I could ask our speakers to become our panelists and come up onto the stage. I am going to become a panelist too, and I'm going to ask Gavin Costigan, who is the Director of Public Policy at Southampton, to now chair the panel and introduce the topic that we're going to discuss. Gavin.
Thanks very much, everyone. We're going to talk about how we actually deliver the Sustainable Development Goals as part of this panel session. Just to remind all of you to wait for the microphone and to hold it right under your chin when you get it, because otherwise people watching on the live stream won't actually hear the questions, even if we can hear them in the room. So we've got some fantastic and very different talks this evening. Does anyone want to start the questions? Yeah, there's a lady over there in the back, please.
Good evening. Can you hear me? I keep talking? Okay, there we go. Good evening. My name is Martha Wakoli. I'm an electrical engineer from Kenya. And at the University of Southampton, pursuing a master's in energy and sustainability. So I should begin actually by saying thank you to the Secretary General of the Commonwealth for literally facilitating my presence here. I'm here on a Shivning Award, so thank you. Moving on, I'd like to ask, how do we increase awareness and participation of young people, especially in the developing countries, in implementing the SDGs? And then following on Ms. Hines' relation of her experience in Malawi, which for me is just life, I guess, but in your case it was an experience. What tools exist specifically for youth and women to then hold their governments accountable to deliver on these commitments? Thank you.
Brilliant. Baroness Scotland.
Firstly, can I say that everything we're doing in the Commonwealth is highlighting the need for young people's engagements. If you look at what we're doing on the Commonwealth Youth Council, we have 9 networks in relation to various aspects of Commonwealth work, but one of them is specifically directed towards climate change. And so the SDGs are an integral part, in fact, of all that we're doing, because the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, as I said, are actually the 16 elements of our charter with, in the preamble, partnership being what links it all together. So the engagement of young people has become a critical part of everything that we're doing. And one of the opportunities we're taking is through lectures like this and other events to try and make sure that people understand that this is the business for the 60% of the Commonwealth who are below 30. In countries like Uganda, 78% are below 30 and 59% are below 18. So this push to make sure that we engage young people is absolutely critical. And I'm really glad you're an engineer.
Gwen, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I mean, really good question. And of course, engaging the youth is fundamental because, you know, I won't be alive in 2200. You know, my kids won't be alive. But you thinking about the future, and as you said, that discount rate that people apply to, you know, when do I worry about this is very, very high. And getting people who care about the future. We were having a discussion recently about plastics. You know, my kids care fundamentally about plastics in the ocean. Other people don't because behaviour is not changing. So it's really important. Question is how. In the UK, we do it through schools. You know, we do it through information, that kind of thing. In developing countries, it's harder. But, you know, again, a developing country is not one country, obviously. It's very different in Kenya than it is in Malawi. It's very different if you live in Nairobi than if you're living in a village. I'm a big believer in information and transparency. Too often, it's really hard to find out what's going on. And so we're having a really big push, I mean, across the Commonwealth, across many countries on transparency. Even in the UK, you know, I want to know what's going on. I want to know who's investing in what and what's happening, what that progress is. Like I said, the Office of National Statistics is independent and tracks it. But, you know, if you're talking about women in the village, it's harder. You know, it's the time to think about it. It's the cultural stuff. You know, Malawi, a lot of sub-Saharan Africa, it's big man politics. You don't question Nabwana because he's the president and he's the one running the country. We had a really nice project when I was there, actually working in the village level about what do people care about and finding ways for people to get involved that worked around the time they're spending in the field, that worked around the duties they had, but was also about local solutions. Because actually, you know, these are really scary statistics about the oceans. But if you present that to somebody who might die next month, what do they do about it? And so it's making people understand what they can do. You know, and some of the issues, for example, having a toilet in the local clinic. Well, if 100,000 people are served by that clinic, actually each providing one kwacha means you can solve that problem. But then you escalate the problems they can't solve themselves to the right level. And absolutely, sea level rise, I mean, the fundamentals of climate change are something which internationally some countries are just not accepting. And so that's something we have to take internationally and have to deal with. So it's taking problems to the right level that you can actually think about them.
Great. Mark, Sybren, do you want to come in on this? Or?
One word, education, formal and informal, I think is critical.
Okay. Should we take another question? Yes, the gentleman just here. There's a microphone just coming to you.
My name is Sohail Aymar. I've been at Southampton University. I'm very interested in climate change. I brought my young daughter, who's extremely worried about the future, to hear you. What I'm interested in is, in your view, which are the countries in this world that are actually doing something about climate change? If you had a league table, who's on top? Who are the top? Which are the top 5 countries? Because, you know, we've heard a lot of words from politicians, we've had lots of goals and ambitions, but who's actually doing it?
Who wants to start with that? Do one of the university people want to talk first? What's since you...
Sybren?
Okay, I'm the guy for the bad message. I would almost say nobody really is doing enough, and we all know. So the goals of Paris are beautiful, and I fully endorse it, and I think it's important as a first step. But then came the agreed national contributions. They're not enough to reach the goals. And the pledges made to fulfill these contributions are also not fulfilled by any country. So we really run the danger here of a story of too little, too late. On the other hand, and I think that should be reinforced, I think Europe is doing a bit more than most other countries. Also because we can afford it, of course, and we have already a whole history of being rich and have a lot of welfare. But here, at least, the emissions are going down. And that's unfortunately the only continent where that's taking place. So here again, we need to engage the rest of the world, especially the developing countries again, and motivating the people to really go to a more carbon neutral economy while they develop their economy. And that's a little bit a devil's dilemma, which, my neighbors can say much more, because you have to develop yourself in a way that doesn't give as much prosperity as in the old way. So we really need to take the lead and give the good example, and otherwise the other countries will never do it. But this is also a little bit my message. It's also in the interest of the rich countries, of England, of Holland. Yeah? Because everybody has to do something, and otherwise we will drown as well.
What about China?
Well, sorry, just other people in the panel.
I think one of the clear sad things is the people who are doing the most are the people who are the most affected and who made the least contribution to the problem. So if you look at the small nation states within the Commonwealth who face the existential threat with a degree of immediacy, they have understood that their very existence is at risk. So if you talk to the Pacific, if you talk to the Caribbean, if you talk to the smaller states within the Indian Ocean, because these issues are omnipresent. So there's a sort of two questions. Who's doing the most? Maybe the small, vulnerable states, but who's having the most impact is not them. And so one of the things that has happened, and it's sad and tragic, but this summer, I think, has brought about a shift. Because we have actually seen the impact of total devastation. So there was a time when people thought we were all calling wolf. You know, that small cut states were talking about existential threat, and you almost felt like people were going, yeah. Well, now you have a visual example of what that existential threat looks like, and we can quantify it. But the other thing that's happening, which I think is really interesting, is as we are spending more and more money in developing green technology, we're getting to a stage where a number of people hope that within the next 5 years, it may be cheaper to use green energy than it will be to use fossil fuels. And at the time when that crossover comes, where the economics makes us green, that's when the quantum shift is going to happen. And I think one of the most exciting things that happened in Paris was not just the agreement, but by the fact that that agreement was made, business became aware that now there is an opportunity to make money out of creating the new energy sources. So we're now looking at not just electric cars, but we're looking at electric aeroplanes, and we're looking at the Hyperloop, which is going to speed the rate of technological development and means we'll be traveling more. So if you think about all of us, we're now all using an iPhone or a smartphone. I don't want to advertise for Apple. And that has radically changed in the last 10 years, everything we do. And so technological developments that we were not aware of 25 years ago, which have radically changed our lives, are on their way. And one of the things I think is exciting in terms of the innovation is, will those innovations help us to change the paradigm that we are speaking of, and will they do it fast enough? And I think the answer to that is most of us fear they won't, but we really need to make a good opportunity to give it a chance. And we do have a real opportunity, because I think human genius got us into this mess. And human genius is going to have to get us out. And I think we're pretty smart.
Gwen, did you want to answer the question as to who are the bad boys?
Yeah, I mean, China's doing loads in terms of green tech. And I think they've spotted there's a market there. And actually the power needs in China are so huge. And I think the same, that actually it's when people see that there is a way to overcome this. And, maybe it is the psychology side, but you bring people impossible problems, they don't act. They just think, too hard. Even in the UK, if you think about what people vote on now, it's not sea level rises in 150 years or more. It's what happens today, what happens to the economy, what happens to my life, what happens to my school. Even to make the case for investing in East Africa at the moment, as you say, the migration issues are huge. Something we often say in DFID, there's 15 million people who are refugees in Africa. So it's not actually the people who've reached Europe, it's what's already going on, the reality there. But we talk about a post-truth world. So I think the challenge for all of us is, how do we get people to listen to the facts and listen to the science? But you have to bring people solutions. And I do think, and maybe it's the optimist in me, but I do think that there'll come a time when things do speed up in terms of the solution. When you do international negotiations, getting a perfect deal is impossible. But I do think COP was a starting point, and the kind of partnerships Baroness Scotland is talking about, which are beginning to develop, hopefully, if we get them right, enable you to speed up and build to the next stage. Because if you'd walked out of the negotiations and said it's not enough, you walk out. The trade deal in Seattle I worked on years ago came really close, and then it didn't happen, and then we never ever got a trade deal. So you have to build up, and you have to use incentive mechanisms to move forwards. But I think if there's one thing we can do, it's to communicate science and information and to get people to listen, because that's the biggest gap at the moment.
Okay, I'm going to take another question. There's a gentleman here.
Thank you. Robert Gordon-Clark, I'm an alumni of Southampton. I'm interested in PR, so I look at pictures and listen to words. I'm not good on graphs. And I wanted to ask a quick question for each of you. Baroness Scotland used the phrase regenerative development quite a lot. Could you just expand on what it means a little bit more? Because I'm very interested in the phrase. Gwen, Sadiq Khan, our Mayor of London, has come out with a very strong environmental audit of London in his London plan last week, which many of us are very strongly supportive of. Could you name me one or two other political leaders you're experiencing through DFID around the world who are helping to bang the drum? And a slightly trite question for Sybren, but looking at your hackathon, is our protection around London, and most notably the wall that comes up and down on the Thames Barrier, is it good enough for us in the next few years, or do we need to get your Dutch advisors over for something else? Thank you.
Okay, we got, 3 questions in one. Well done, very good.
Sneaky.
But, and nothing for Mark. Baroness Scotland, regenerative development, sorry.
Regenerative development is really a way of synthesizing all the things that we need to do in relation to the SDGs, the Paris Agreement, and the other social and economic commitments that we've made in relation to the Charter. Because what we saw, was that before we all had everything in hermetically sealed compartments, and yet they were all interrelated. If we're going to deliver on the SDGs, we have to deliver on Paris. If we're going to deliver on Paris, we have to understand better our oceans. And at the moment, up until now, we didn't have a separate conflagration of all the things we need to do in oceans. And we noticed that you've got climate change, but the oceans are the other side of the coin. And we had to bring them together. We had to create a model which would regenerate as opposed to deplete. And so the new development has to be a regenerative model of developing so that we get better, we enrich, and we try and restore, mitigate, and adapt in ways that will reduce the damage that we're causing. So it's about doing it in a holistic way, in a partnership way, in understanding the correlation between land and sea and people, and building on what we know locally, what works and what doesn't work. And it's about doing that in a way that regenerates our world, because we only have the one blue planet. And we've discovered, I think most scientists say, that there is another planet upon which we could live. Regrettably, it's 500 light years away. So it may take us a little while to get there. And so we've only got this one planet. And so in the Commonwealth, we've been concentrating on all the things we have in common. What can we share? What we can produce? And we're coming up with this idea of a common earth. It's part of our commons. And this bringing together of partnership is what will help us to regenerate what we need to have in order to survive. And hence, in the 18 months when we had climatologists, oceanologists, we had scientists of all disciplines, as well as psychologists. Yeah. We all came together to say, if this is the paradigm shift that needs to be made, how do we do that collectively? And out of those 3 significant meetings came the idea that we had to regenerate. And the regenerative model is the way in which we get to deliver SDGs and Paris and our justice system. And it's predicated on fairness. And one of the reasons that I'm actually optimistic is because within the Commonwealth, we have countries of all different sizes who have each to deliver on these SDGs. And we're all trying to do the same thing at the same time. None of us have enough money on our own. But if we can collaborate, share and help each other, collectively, we have enough money to do it. And it is the interrelationship. And I just want to give you one example as to one of the things which is people see as a total legal issue, but it will be an important issue. The difference, the amount of money that we have to deliver the Sustainable Development Goals globally, and the amount of money we need are 2 different figures. And the gap between the amount of money that we have and the amount of money we need is the sum equivalent to that which is siphoned off by corruption. So if we can impinge and make it more and more difficult for the corrupt to survive and reduce that level of corruption, we get the money which enables us to develop the SDGs. So all of these things are interrelated. And because they're interrelated, we've got to look at them together if we're going to deliver a regenerative model which actually meets the needs of all of us and leaves no one behind.
Brilliant, thank you. Gwen, does anyone else have a Sadiq Khan?
I mean, you know this more than me. I mean, but to me, it's about pictures. So coming here on the tube, yeah, you know, he's not only putting in place targets, but he's doing a public campaign about why it matters. So, you know, one of the pictures I walked past is a baby's bottle covered in dirt. You know, and that, hey, guys, if you could see the dirt in London, you'd want to clean it up. This is what I'm doing. So it's making something live for you. I mean, the cabinet held underwater, Maldives, I think it was. Yep. You know, really powerful of actually sea levels rising. And your first graphic of, you know, the joys of London underwater is something we should get Sadiq Khan to stick around London, frankly, and say, hey, guys, you know, we need to worry about climate change. I mean, people are doing different things, but it's getting people who can appeal to different markets. You know, Elon Musk is great to appeal to people who are interested in tech and who like business and like big ideas and things. He's great, but he's not someone who's going to work elsewhere. You know, it's Nick Stern's done a really good job of trying to push the economic argument for climate change, working with Al Gore, working with others. It works for economists. Actually, for many of you, a scientific picture will work much better. The Blue Planet program is frankly doing wonders for people caring about the ocean and dealing with plastic. So, let's harness David Attenborough. Richard Branson and his wine cellar in the Caribbean, made it real to people of what a Cat 5 hurricane feels like if you're living in the Caribbean. And people do want something that relates to them. People are also, in some cases, selfish. When did people start caring about Ebola? When it looked like it might spread to Europe or America. So I do think there's a lot of people who are altruistic and who care and who are globally engaged. But we need to find a way to convert those who aren't interested, and that's the challenge, and that's where PR comes in.
Sybren, a very brief word about the Thames Barrier.
Okay, then I'll constrain myself only to the barrier. Well, I wanted almost to react on everything said. There is a project going on between the Met Office and a few people, and also the Dutch Met Office and people like me, called Ice Storm, which is relating these kind of sea level scenarios to the demands of the Thames Barrier. When do we need to replace it, and how big or how different has it to be to indeed to be usable in the next century? So you don't have to worry that the Thames Barrier will completely fail within 10 years. Again, I always say before 2050 we won't see these dramatic accelerations won't happen before 2050. So we are safe. But coming back to, doesn't matter what happens in 100 years, if talking to this Deltares hackathon, these measurements you have to take to protect your country over what will happen in 150 years, take 100 to 150 years to really build the infrastructure. So we need to start thinking now. And a little bit, I'm maybe a little bit less liberal than the general UK citizen, or I believe a little bit more leadership from the governments would really help in these kind of transitions, and believing that the market or the people or one single genius is going to solve it without some sort of strong incentive from above is, well, it's the job of a politician to be optimistic and up to the naive, and for the scientist it's his job to be a skeptic. But yeah, I think we need a bit more. For instance, we might need a tax on carbon to make all these things happen, although nobody wants to pay tax in this country. But I think we can't afford this attitude.
Okay, I'm going to take one more question from the floor. There's a lady in a white shirt just there.
Hi. Hello. Can you hear me? Yes. My name's Elle Lashka. I'm a geoscientist and alumni of Southampton University. And throughout all of your talks, I found the theme of partnership really interesting. And I was quite interested to know, during negotiations on climate policy and how best to tackle these issues, what you've found in your experience have been the biggest stumbling blocks. Was it purely financial, or have there been education issues? Or, I mean, obviously with Trump there are some large issues, but and how have you best found to tackle them?
Gwen.
Wow, there's a question. Could do a whole year on international negotiation.
You got about a minute?
Yeah. It's a combination. I mean, I think it is, and just to be really clear, I completely agree we do have to tackle these problems. I'm just giving you the reality of the incentive structures that operate, which is that you have to make it matter to people, and you have to come up with facts and figures that they cannot just bat away and deny. And in the current climate, and talk about the US, that's getting harder and harder. So it is finding people who do want to come together and work together, and it is building that personal relationship. And a lot of negotiations, it is down to key figures and what happens at the last minute when somebody moves. So it's a whole combination of things.
I think I've always found that the best, and I agree with Gwen, the best way of negotiating is to go and hunt in the other person's bailiwick. Because if you want something to be achieved, you have to ask the question, why should the other person care about this? What does it mean to them? And I found it incredibly useful to look at things through their lens and say, if I were on the other side of the table, what would you have to say to me to enable me to see that this mattered to me? And quite often, as Gwen says, that's what you end up doing. And telling stories is a really great way to do it, and helping people to see that it's their story too, and it's not just yours. So looking at it through the other person's lens is critical. And certainly in the Commonwealth, where we have so many things in common, it's been a really successful thing to look on first what joins you. What do you agree on? And quite often you'll find that you agree on 99%, and then when you come to look at the 1% you don't agree on, you've contextualized it by the fact that you've managed to agree on everything else. So the things you don't agree on don't look so important as the things that you do. But it's finding out what matters to people and working really hard on that.
Brilliant. We're coming very close to the end of our time.
Could I just say something very briefly on that? That a couple of things around universities and education again. You know, I think universities are incredibly special places of allowing people from completely different cultures to come and meet and discuss hard things in a relatively safe environment. And I think that's something really special that feels rather under threat in this country, but in the US and elsewhere at the moment. The other bit is actually learning, rather expanding on what Baroness Scotland said, learning the other person's language, literally. Learning languages matters. Learning the science and numeracy to handle data in a sophisticated way is also really important. So a politician talking to a scientist, they need to understand each other's language. The scientists need to understand what policy is going to be informed by, and equally the politician needs to understand the science and the maths, the language that goes with it. Those are big barriers that I think education universities have a really important role to overcome. And going back to the earlier question, no one country can solve these on their own. It is about different countries coming together, negotiating, trusting, respecting. And again, universities in a microcosm allow that to happen. And I think that's really important and something that needs to be treasured and fed if in the long term we're going to make a difference here.
And I think I should say that as a result, one of the most important things I think we in the Commonwealth can do is to develop empirically based, objective policy development, and to move from ideological policy development to evidence-based policy development. So you've noticed that all the things I've been talking about is what works and what does not work. And what works, you have to have the empirical data which demonstrates the catalytic impact that certain policy changes may have. And so getting away from ideology and into evidence-based, structured policy development is something which we can do collectively at the Commonwealth, because we have no skin in the game. And there's no political angle, it's just facts.
So I'm going to take chair's privilege to ask the last question to all of the panel. And this reflects something that Gwen said, which was that we set these goals for 2030 and the tendency may be to forget them until 2028. So my question to each of you is, what are the most important things we need to do in the next 12 months? And why don't we start with Sybren and just work down the panel.
12 months, well, that's a very general question. I think that we really should reinforce Paris and Bonn, because the climate is really the thing I'm passionate about. And this really means the biggest problem we have, so it has been talked about, we can go green, but the problem with green energy, for instance, for wind and solar energy, is we can't store it. And when do we use electricity in our countries? When it's dark and when it's winter. So the sun doesn't shine, and when it's very cold also the winds are very low. So there we have to make a real jump ahead. So we need better programs in our universities. Also I'm in the geology department, and we don't do anything about sustainable planet or these kind of programs, which we have in Holland, but I haven't seen them in Southampton. We could do much more to save the planet, also at our university. Gwen?
Two with a kind of link. Get the facts out there. Please, 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 get the facts out there. We cannot have a post-truth world. There's no future in a post-truth world. And engage the youth.
Brilliant. Baroness Scotland.
I'm going to be really parochial because I've got a very clear 12-month plan. And to say, for me, it's developing partnerships. Understanding that you cannot do this on your own, but you can do it if you build the right partnerships with the right people. And so from the Commonwealth points of view, it means using the next summit in London to bring the 53 countries together and get those 53 countries to agree a progressive, deliverable, outcome-focused agenda which will really help us on climate change and will also help us delivering the SDGs, because every country has a plan for SDGs. And so for me, I intend to pursue with vigor the innovation hub. So I've been telling everyone I'm a magpie. I will steal every good idea that I can find and share it so that the Commonwealth can help each other, because we have countries of every shape and every size. And if we do that, we will be a pathway for the rest of the world. And I think we can do it. So I've got a very clear 3-month, 6-month, 9-month, 12-month plan. Please come and look at it. And if you can help me to deliver it in partnership, I'm saying thank you in advance. And I can say thank you to Southampton because they've sort of said yes.
It's our pleasure. That's a really mean question, really mean that I'm last, because you might expect me to have a really good answer. And there I was contemplating the effects of my ice melting in my gin and tonic at the reception afterwards. I think, actually, really to amplify something Gwen said, it just feels to me at the moment that all of this is negotiable and deniable. And the Sustainable Development Goals are, yes, acknowledged, governments are doing it, but it's not the top thing on the list. And it feels like it ought to be the top thing on the list. And it couples with actually people being confronted by data, don't make the data-informed choice, make a choice that is perhaps ideological or is local and parochial. And we need to find a way to get beyond that and find, perhaps in using my words of the previous answer, a common language worldwide. And the Commonwealth is an excellent starting place for that, to actually get the collective action that's required, that I was about to say trumps, and I realise that's a really bad choice, that overcomes the local self-interest. And finding that language, evidence-based, picture-based, whatever it is, I think is something that could be usefully done in the next 12 months.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much. And could I just ask you to join me in thanking our speakers and the panel.